Very good afternoon. May I welcome you all to this event. And I'm not going to stand between what Professor Surajan Das, the Honorable Vice Chancellor, is going to say, and a sort of remarks by Mr. Buthalingam. So I'm not going to stand in between for much. It gives me immense pleasure, in fact, to say a few words in terms of a formal sort of a welcome. So the School of International and Strategic Studies is an interdisciplinary body of research which was established in 1987. The special interest of the school is in areas of international relations and strategic studies, in foreign policy and event analysis, and on emerging issues and concepts of global politics. And we normally organize seminars, workshops, invited lectures throughout the year. The school functions primarily as a forum for academic discussions on matters related to security and strategy. And normally, any proposal which we receive to partner is, from any place, we have usually accepted and organized events within the university. And so we are very happy that we could do this time. The school, Jadavpur University, warmly welcomes the Institute of Chinese Studies and the Ananta Center in partnering with us to hold this seminar on India and China as rising powers in the world order, influences of history and culture, as part of the China Symposia series. I welcome our Vice Chancellor, Sir, to this inaugural session, and we are extremely thankful that he has so graciously accepted our invitation to address us at the inaugural session despite his extremely busy schedule. I warmly welcome all the honorary fellows and other delegates from the ICS and the Ananta Center, and to Ambassador Krishnan Srinivasan for their participation. I also welcome all the paper presenters and chairs and moderators to the event. I'm also welcoming Dr. Imankola Nahiri, who in fact has made this event possible, Ms. Anuja Shaha, who sort of done the liaison and steered the administrative aspects of the event. A very warm welcome to the head of the Department of International Relations. Despite her very busy schedule running the department, I'm very happy that she could be here, and I hope that she will be able to stay for a while with the program. And finally, a very warm welcome to the audience, some of the members of the academic committee of the school, Professor Siddhartha Mitra and everybody else. And given the significance of the topic, the importance of the topic, I think it is absolutely a matter of, I would say, self-evidence that we need to have discussions on what is happening in the very complex relations between India on one hand and China on the other. So without any further ado, may I now request Professor Surajan Das, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur University, to say a few words. Yes.
Thank you, Shivashish. Respected Mr. Ravi Buthalingam, other distinguished members of the House, which includes Ambassador Srinivasan, with whom I had the very good privilege of working very closely while I was at Calcutta University, and I do hope we'll be able to work very closely with you in Jadavpur. My esteemed colleagues from Department of International Relations and other departments, and of course my very dear students. Could I first put on record University's sincere thanks to ICS and Ananta Center for choosing Jadavpur University to organize this particular session. With the Institute of Chinese Studies, Jadavpur University has already signed a MOU, and I view this particular session in a broader context of enriching that particular MOU that we have signed. Shivashish had mentioned special remarks against my name. I do not know whether I have the expertise of making any special remarks on the topic, particularly when there are so many experts present, particularly Ambassador Srinivasan. But perhaps I would take a few minutes of your precious time to make one or two statements around the problematic which has been chosen for discussion, and perhaps if those points can be considered relevant, you can discuss it in a session, or if you consider those points irrelevant, I don't mind if you throw those points outside the window. Let me start by emphasizing the point. Despite various odds, there is a particular positive chemistry between India and China. And this positive chemistry between India and China was clearly manifest by the way the recent standoff was addressed. There are many strategists who would say that the way the recent standoff was addressed reflected certain geostrategic realities. That might be true. But I view it in a broader context of the strong historical links between these two neighbors. And that is exactly the theme that is being addressed today. And of course, as is evident from the program, you will be addressing various aspects of this historical, cultural, social, economic links between the two nations. But I would like to point out, particularly at the stage in which we are standing, especially in the relationship between the two great powers, mere recounting of the historical links, mere recounting of the rich cultural heritage that binds these two civilizations is not enough. We need to perhaps think in new ways, in novel ways, how this historical linkage between the two nations can be used for mutual benefit of the two nations. I mean, there is abundance literature which emphasizes the cultural linkage, the religious linkage, the economic linkage and so on. But how do we use that linkage to the mutual benefit of the two nations? And in that context, I would like to make a submission. As I see it, if we really want to utilize the existing historical linkage between the two nations for mutual benefit of the two nations, perhaps we need to go beyond what I would call the established Delhi-centric viewpoint of Indo-Chinese relations. I strongly believe that, like many other aspects of Indian federalism, although we call ourselves Indian federalism, it is a very strong unitary bias. I do feel that, as on many other issues, even on Indian foreign policy issues or on international issues, Indians do not speak in one voice. What can be true for Delhi might not be true for Bengal, might not be true for Kerala, might not be true for Madras, might not be true for Maharashtra. And in order to give due credence to pluralism, in order to give due credence to a cultural diversity, political diversity, social diversity, I do believe, particularly when we deal with India's relationship with neighbors like China, we need to go beyond what I call the traditional Delhi-centric viewpoint of looking at the relationship between India and China. Instead, I would strongly argue that we need to adopt what I would call a decentralized and disaggregated approach in addressing the relationship between India and China. And I would strongly emphasize the point that we need to take into account our strong historical linkages to develop what I call a sub-regional relationship. The contours of sub-regional relationship we can discuss, but we need to develop sub-regional approach in developing, in maturing, in enhancing, in enriching the relationship between India and China. Now, what do I mean by sub-regional approach? By sub-regional approach, I essentially mean bringing together geographically proximate regions between two neighboring states. If we bring together, for example, Northeast India and West Bengal and the region around Yunnan in China, you immediately attempt what I would call the sub-regional approach to the development of Indo-Chinese relationship. And as I said, if a sub-regional relationship can be developed between eastern and northeastern India, which include Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, Tripura and West Bengal, and the neighboring southwest provinces of China, which include Yunnan, Sichuan, Gizian, Tibet, Gongshai and the autonomous region of Chongqing, I believe we can break new grounds in what I would call constructive Sino-Indian bilateralism. These two regions, the northeast and eastern India of India and the southwestern part of China, are bound culturally and economically to three land routes. A, the South Silk Route beginning from Sichuan through Yunnan, touching India and reaching Persia. Second, the Tea Horse Road connecting Yunnan, Sichuan and Tibet across Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal and India. And of course the modern Steel Well Road. So there is already a cultural and connectivity between these two regions. Cultural link and connectivity between these two regions. Both areas again are strategically located. And these two regions together serve a hinterland of an emerging market of 400 billion people, encompassing India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, Myanmar and Nepal. Both regions again have immense mineral, forestry, horticultural and natural gas reserves which virtually lie untapped. Both regions again have demographic diversity and considerable tourism prospects. Both regions again share a rich, eclectic cultural heritage. Yet these two regions, compared to the respective mainlands of the two countries, are relatively less underdeveloped. What I would therefore argue is, if we take into account the main theme of the program, deciphering historical legacy, cultural legacy between India and China, and juxtapose that at the subnational level, these two regions can act as what I would call natural bridgeheads in enriching the relationship between India and China. I shan't go into the details of the prospects of enhancing economic linkages between these two regions. I've written it elsewhere exhaustively. But to highlight some of the main suggestions that have come forward. The development of a rail connectivity between Kunming and Kolkata, which have already been declared as sister cities. Development of a Yunnan-India economic corridor, which will provide India with an access to Chinese and Southeast Asian markets, and China will be provided with an entry point to South Asia. What is interesting, this proposed corridor will pass through the southern part of West Bengal's North 24 Parganas district, particularly through Barasat, which will be of immense economic importance for the development of this part of the country, that is West Bengal. We very often forget that Yunnan itself is increasingly attracting a larger number of businessmen from West Bengal. In 2010 alone, an estimated 6,000 businessmen from West Bengal went to Dehong province of Yunnan. The city of Delhi is emerging as a catchment area for West Bengal businessmen. Such projects like Greater Mekong Sub-Region project can also be utilized in a way to develop what I call the sub-regional cooperation between India and China, encompassing the northeastern part of India and the Yunnan area of China. As we all know, the historic Nathula Pass was opened on 6 July 2007. Unfortunately, the full potentials have not yet been realized. But again, I think it is in the interest of West Bengal and northeastern part of India and the Yunnan part of China to work together to ensure that this Nathula Pass becomes economically viable, economically vibrant, and can provide new entry points for promoting economic linkages on the sub-national level that I've just mentioned. Incidentally, as I remember Ambassador Srinivasan mentioning in one of the seminars that I had organized while I was in Calcutta University, he mentioned that Kolkata is probably the only Indian city to have a Chinatown. And there's immense possibility of utilizing this Chinatown to promote linkages between this part of India and the neighboring Yunnan province of China. According to the latest unofficial sources, the trade between Yunnan and West Bengal has already touched US dollars 0.76 billion. And there are immense possibilities of enhancing that. Again, I have written elsewhere on this subject, so I shan't take much of your time on this. I would end by arguing that the other untapped area in the realm of subnational collaboration between India and northeastern India on one hand and Yunnan area on the other is the further development of the cultural element, the cultural linkage between these two regions. Only yesterday, the Chinese Consulate General in Calcutta and the Chinese Language School had jointly organized a very high-level conference on promoting India-China educational linkage, and I had the privilege of addressing that particular session. I remember having attended a luncheon meeting at Raj Bhavan when the former Chinese Vice President was visiting Calcutta two years back. And he clearly identified Vishwabharati and Jadavpur University as the two natural, Chinese are very fond of using the term bridges. And he clearly identified Jadavpur University and Vishwabharati as the two natural bridges of promoting Indo-Chinese academic exchange programs, particularly centering around the Yunnan province and West Bengal and northeastern part of India. Unfortunately, this possibility still remains untapped. In Jadavpur University, we still have a China Center. Our international relations and the School of Strategic Studies are quite active. Last year, we had the occasion to organize a national level India-China workshop, which was largely funded by the government of West Bengal. And we had the occasion to invite a number of former Indian diplomats who have served in the People's Republic of China. And frankly, I was quite impressed by the level of the participation of the students in that particular seminar. And I do believe that Jadavpur can play a very important role in promoting this, what I call a new cultural entry point of developing sub-regional, sub-national collaboration between Northeast India and India on the one hand and the Yunnan sector on the other. It is no point in just debate in trying to develop a broad macro level relationship, thinking of broad macro level relationship all the time, particularly when we are speaking of a diversified pluralist India on the one hand and a diversified, increasingly diversified pluralist China on the other. Only if the two peoples accounting for more than 1/3 of the world population can join hands could the two countries enable the 21st century to be the Asian century. In sum, what I would argue, that of course we should discuss the civilizational linkage between India and China as you would be discussing. But mere discussion of the civilizational linkage is not enough. We need to utilize that civilizational linkage, the vast reservoir of civilizational linkage between India and China, and to go ahead to think in new terms how the relationship between India and China can be improved by falling back on the civilizational linkage. And one way that I thought was to promote the sub-regional cooperation between India and China, which would be mutually beneficial for the Yunnan area as well as for West Bengal and the northeastern part of India. Could I conclude with what I would still call a very pertinent remark from Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru when he prophesied long time back, and I quote, "It is not a question of my trusting China or not trusting China, but it is a question nevertheless of my realizing that China and India, two great countries, are going through enormous changes which are strengthening them, making them powerful, modern states, and that they are next to each other and have to remain for millennia to come next to each other," unquote. And that I think clearly should be a guiding spirit as we discuss new roles for Indo-China friendship and collaboration and cooperation. Thank you very much indeed. And with this, I once again thank the department for enabling me to be here and wish the seminar every success. Thank you.
Professor Shuranjan Das, Vice Chancellor, Professor Shivashish Chatterjee, Director and Head of the School of International Relations and Strategic Studies. First of all, may I thank Jadavpur University, the Vice Chancellor and the Director for their gracious hospitality in hosting today's seminar. We are very grateful, and it's a continuation of the long partnership that the Institute of Chinese Studies has, which we are very happy to keep going from strength to strength. Now, after the inspiring introduction given by the Vice Chancellor, I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes setting out what today's seminar means in the larger context of what we have called the China Symposia. The reason for these symposia is very simple. India and China are each about 1.3 billion people. But our awareness of China, even amongst the so-called informed public, is very low. And the same is the case, I might add, of Chinese people about India. Such a situation of mutual lack of knowledge is not only dangerous at one level, it also stops us from utilizing the many opportunities that such knowledge and connectivity might provide us. So with this background, 3 years ago, the Institute of Chinese Studies started a series called the China Symposia to bring before the informed public, people like yourselves, this enthusiastic capacity audience that I see here, whether it's in universities, across industry, government, and the informed public. We wanted to discuss and put forward different aspects of China, not just the border issue or the security concerns that we hear about in our newspapers, but the history of China, the culture of China, the economy, the politics, the education, and many other aspects. So this initiative started in 2015, where we had 3 seminars in Delhi on the economy of China. Then we had another 3 seminars followed by a round table. We then had the next year 3 seminars on the politics of China, and carrying on the idea that you mentioned, Vice Chancellor, we did not want to make it Delhi-centric, so we started taking it to other cities. The first was Pune. The next on our list, happily, is Kolkata, and we plan to take it on to Chennai and to Mumbai in subsequent months, and covering different areas. Here, as you see, it is history and culture. Then further will be environment and science, and also connectivity, land and maritime. There are many other themes. And what we want to come out of this, because this is a product, as the Vice Chancellor said, merely talking is not enough. What do we get out of it? So we publish a series of policy papers. We publish a series of action plans what can actually come out of all these discussions we have been having. So you will see your views reflected in one form or the other in these policy papers and in our advocacy that these seminars should be put to use. So with these words, may I once again thank the university. One final administrative point as I close is my colleague Naina Singh, who is standing here, is recording these proceedings on camera and video, and it will be on the net and on the websites of the Institute of Chinese Studies as well as the Ananta Center. We normally make this announcement so that you are fully informed. If anybody has a serious objection to their speech or presentation not appearing, please convey the same to Naina over here and we will take care of it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Again, very warm thanks to Professor Suranjan Das, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of the University, for making time and addressing us. Thanks, Mr. Buddhalingam. I think we are now absolutely ready to get into the working sessions, and the first session is going to be moderated by Ambassador Krishnan Srinivasan. So I would invite Mr. Srinivasan to take his position, and the presenters are Shaburi Mitro, who is a professor JNU and honorary fellow ICS. And she's going to talk on reinventing heritage, emerging interfaces of India-China cultural exchange. And we have a very different kind of a paper coming next, which is by Dr. Anindra Jyoti Majumdar, who is a professor at the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, speaking on contending strategic cultures. And the final paper is by Zhang Jianxin, who is a cultural counselor Embassy of China, and he's going to speak on culture and history of Chindia. So without any further ado, may I ask the paper presenters to be here.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Kindly settle down. We'd like to start straight away with Professor Mitro, who is going to speak on emerging interfaces of India-China cultural exchange. So, please. The idea is that each speaker will take about 10 to 15 minutes, after which we'll have some questions from the floor.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers, and it's particularly a proud moment for me to be coming back to JU, because this is where the first outreach of All India China Studies Conference was brought to in 2010, and also a special day for me. I complete 27 years of my teaching career today. So on that note, it's always a challenge to be the first speaker, but the opening remarks by the Vice Chancellor made things much easier for me. I'll start by making some of the very well-documented statements, if I should say, that India and China are ancient civilizations with rich cultural traditions, and they have interacted with each other for several thousands of years. And going by the definition of cultural exchange, with people-to-people exchange at the core, there has been two components of this. This cultural exchange is one of the two components of this civilizational interaction. And this legacy of the dialogue between India and China have been unique in each phase of history. If we look at the ancient period, where it was driven really by the shared interest in Buddhism, spread of Buddhism to China, and translations of Buddhist texts. So Buddhism was in the driving seat of the India-China interactions in the ancient period. By the time we were close to the 19th century, in fact after the 1840 especially, that is the China's Opium War, the colonial linkages and our responses individually to the colonial powers' efforts at colonizing Asia was what that shaped the discourse, starting from the end of the 19th century and through the first part of the 20th century. And it is with that background that Rabindranath went to China in 1924, and he is the one who reminded us that there is a great legacy of civilizational interaction, and we must remember our great legacy and interact with each other again. And that is what was the beginning, in my opinion, of an anti-colonial, anti-imperial kind of a discourse, which was deepened in the 1937 during the Japanese aggression of China, when in his correspondence with the Japanese poet Noguchi, Tagore very, very emphatically took a position that this invasion of China by Japan was extremely wrong. It was morally wrong. It was not part of the Asian civilizational legacy that we have. So this is what shaped the discourse in the first part of the 20th century. And by the time we had the second part of the 20th century, it was a decolonizing Asia. We had become independent, so we were affirming that our mutual and cultural exchange would facilitate development of cooperation in other areas. And gradually, this is how we tried to, in a kind of a top-down approach. There was the discourse that was shaped was, initially with Afro-Asian kind of an unity, and then the cultural interactions. Obviously, after the 1950s, we see in the 62 skirmish, there was a problem, and then through the 10 years of cultural revolution, the interaction was grossly interrupted. But it's after that, during the reform period, that the two countries further decided to follow a 10-pronged strategy, which, in order to substantiate and reinforce their strategic and cooperative partnership. And one of them, by the end of the 20th century, it was very clearly laid out, one of them was revitalizing cultural ties and nurturing people-to-people exchange. I want to quickly look at the terms that are used both in Chinese and Indian languages for the term culture. One is Sanskriti and Yichan in Chinese, which broadly refers to the same kind of understanding, that it's a value system that is inherited through generations of cultivation and refinement and is worthy of appreciation. And even for entertainment, we have the similar kind of understanding of the term. But what is more interesting is the paleographic writing of the word used for culture in China very clearly reflects this process of mutual acculturation that has happened over thousands of years, and in a way it is something that is continuing and will continue, that draws two human figures facing each other in an inverse fashion, one standing on its feet and the other on its head. And this is widely suggests or indicates the process of acculturation that has gone on. So it is clear that through greater part of the second half of 20th century and maybe at the turn of 21st century, what was a very kind of a state-motivated kind of cultural interaction, there were non-state actors that was coming into the picture. And in the non-state actors, what was meant really by that, there were individuals, there were small organizations which were now getting interested in each other's endeavors, and the youth especially, I think, became very interested in how in the globalizing Asia, how the youth of each country was trying to shape their destiny. And it is in this backdrop, I think we must understand the kind of new cultural templates, new templates of cultural interaction that are emerging between India and China. I'm going to talk about two such templates very briefly, just to make my point. One is yoga, which has become extremely popular in China. If you look at the literature that is available on Chinese understanding of yoga, and the reason that they are very interested in practicing yoga is because they look at it as a kind of it is seen as a holistic system of theory and practice that is ancient and yet can be applied and can be practiced through the modern period as a system of health conscious, as a system of what you call it, harmonious development of health in body, mind and soul. And so, while some of the Indian scholars have thought about how Chinese are so very keen on the yoga philosophy, there may be a slight difference in understanding of Chinese scholars or Chinese practitioners as to how they're approaching yoga. They're not necessarily approaching yoga with a spiritual content in mind, but more so as a kind of a harmonious development of health, body and mind and soul, and that is why the chantings of various mantras is also part, as they understand, of that system. Now, quickly going through how they have, how yoga has developed in China since the 1980s. It started with one person called Zhang Huilan, who practiced and telecast yoga lessons in the television, and then gradually, over a period of the next 3 decades almost, they developed a huge market for people who became interested in yoga. Now, I mean, I'm not actually following the text very closely because the text is there for you to see, but the milestones that we need to understand in the development of yoga in China is that in 2002, there was a special particular promulgation by the Chinese government which talks about the need for reforming sports training and teaching in the ordinary institutions of higher learning. It is in that backdrop that yoga, I think, got a final boost. And in 2014 and 15, Yunnan National University actually established a yoga department. Some of my former students are now part of that institutions, and it was a proud moment for them and for us that in 2017 this actually started a degree program in yoga philosophy and practice, and I have looked at the curriculum. It's extremely extensive. The point here I'm really trying to make is yoga is not only a theoretical and practical system that the Chinese are embracing, but we Indians must also appreciate that it's a huge market out there. It's a cultural market that has opened up, and we are taking advantage of it, and we need to take more advantage. So with restriction, just 2 minutes, I will go on to my next template that I wanted to talk about, which is the films, and how there is a reconfiguring of the cultural engagements of Indian films with Chinese audience. We know that in the 1950s there was good old days of Avara and other films which were screened and extremely popular and remains cult, continues to have a cult value in Chinese audience. But it is in the turn of the 20th century, 21st century, that we see that Indian films, which was gradually opening up to the Chinese audience from 1980s, but it is the Lagan and My Name is Khan, Three Idiots, PK and Dhoom, and of course, in the recent period, nobody can ignore the presence of Dangal in China. So Amir Khan is a household name. He has got his own fan following, and they have left behind the competition from the American films. And if you see quickly see the track record of Dangal, which by the way is in Chinese called Shuai Zhao Ba 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 Ba. So let's box. That's the kind of approach. So it's clear that there is a new phase of India-China cultural interaction that has begun, which reflects a reconfiguring, repackaging of the templates that was there. The heritage continues, but the modern period must be taken into account, which India-China relations cultural engagements have done in all phases, and it's time we now reinvent various templates and continue to move forward. Thank you.
Yes, I've got just a question I'd like to ask at this point. It seemed to me that you're speaking of Indian cultural activities or phenomena that are very popular in China. You mentioned yoga, you mentioned the Bollywood films. I'd like to ask you, what are the Chinese cultural phenomena that you think are popular in India?
In a way, it's very easily answered. We have been very, very fond of Chinese cuisine, and to the extent that we have Indianized it. Having said that, there are other aspects of the Chinese culture which is very, very popular. I think in the recent few decades, especially from the end of 20th century, Chinese films, the Bruce Lee films, the martial art films, martial art has captured the Indian imagination very much, of a particular generation when we were very young, in the 80s, late 80s or something. But in the recent times, I think Indian youth need to really look at the Chinese cultural ethos and how the Chinese cultural ethos also has its own continuities and discontinuities. Instead, I think Indian youth is focusing more on the Chinese developmental picture and the trajectory. But at the same time, there are interfaces coming up. Indian theatre artists are very interested in what is happening in China. The rock bands, music is one aspect which is coming up and making a mark. So there are many such possibilities, and they will, I think, make their mark in the years to come.
I read somewhere that Indian Bollywood stars and the rock bands and so on that you're mentioning are actually not going very frequently to China because they charge too much. Have you heard this?
You see, I understand what you are trying to say, but I think in that way the films actually have overcome that barrier more than the rock bands have. But I think rock bands and music is more niche than Bollywood films, because Bollywood films has a very, very greater, larger appeal. And Bollywood films, I think, have really gone from strength to strength. And yes, I think it's a possibility. The other problem with the films is that there was a very limited number that was accepted by the and admitted by the Chinese government, because there is a limitation of number of films that is allowed into China. But I think there is a new agreement that has been signed, and things are moving ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitra. Can I now request Professor Majumdar, please, to say a few words?
Whenever you like, would you like me to?
Thank you, Ambassador Srinivasa. Let's agree on the basic assumption that in contemporary times, prudence, pragmatism and maturity are the essential features of India-China relations. So both these countries have many irritants in their relations, some serious disagreements. Both the countries have their respective strategic perceptions with regard to the shape, substance and nature of global power equations. Both the states with rising aspirations and expectations are dynamic actors in contemporary international politics, looking for favorable changes in their own respective ways in the existing system and power hierarchy. At the same time, both the states are quite aware of the potentially huge mutual benefits that good, friendly cooperation might accrue in terms of economic rewards. And they both realize that the existing system that has made them what they are today, it would not be a very brilliant idea to kind of destabilize it by having a kind of military confrontation among themselves. And there are many untapped possibilities that we have heard in the inaugural session: sub-regionalism, para-diplomacy, and there are various ways through which this cooperation can take place. So confrontation, if any, between these two countries would be a matter of, or a result of, deliberate choice and policy. All historical influences and cultural links and economic advantages would have to be set aside in order to score political or strategic victory. While it is hard to imagine that such hasty and somewhat foolish act on part of both the states would take place, but occasional muscle flexing is and will remain the part of diplomacy. Having said that, basically when I talk about contenting strategic cultures, I have just to, within these 10-12 minutes, I would have to develop just two analytical angles, two arguments. The purpose is to understand why. That is, despite all the maturity, all the pragmatism, all the prudence that these two countries can exhibit, these two countries can use to develop their relations, still India and China face and might continue to face persisting apprehensions about each other. So it is not merely a question of just promoting good relations between the two parties, it is also a question of reducing the possibilities of negative influence of certain perceptions that we harbor about one another. The first angle is essentially geopolitical, and that emphasizes that geography's enduring influence upon history and politics. And geopolitics, in a sense, remains, even today, after all those years of imperialist geopolitics and then people started rubbishing this very idea of geopolitics after the Second World War. But it remains, in essence, the art of relationship between space and politics, searching out facts and principles based on geographical attributes to fulfill national goals. And here, classical geopolitical analysis would always attach much importance to the enduring contest between heartland states and the dreamland states. If you remember those Mackinder days and kind of the ideas term popularized by Spikeman, Mackinder, the basic kind of arguments in any kind of geopolitical study. The heartland power, which is predominantly a land power, at the core, looks for access to oceans and seas, and the dreamland states, predominantly maritime in character, they would seek to repel such penetration in their domain. So basically it's a kind of perception, if one subscribes to these kind of ideas or pushes these kind of ideas as something, some atrocious framework of analysis. Nevertheless, this perception exists, and this perception colors the policies and the formulation of policies by states, especially when most of the major powers in international relations, they set the rules of the game, and others are expected to follow those rules of the game, and there these kind of geopolitical perceptions still remain very important. Asia is a combination of multiple security complexes where each region represents a kind of unique security complex. You can think of East Asia with its own problems, Southeast Asia with its own security problems, South Asia. You can think of Central Asia, West Asia. All these security complexes have their unique security, kind of perceptions. And what is interesting to see here is the geopolitical map of Asia, where China alone shares its borders with 4 of the 5 regions. And it is not very far from West Asia either. And therefore, it is located almost at the core of a kind of continental maritime Asia. If we think of the kind of Middle Kingdom it perceives itself to be, and the heartland of Asia. Now, when the heartland seeks to expand its influence beyond its borders, you can call it Belt and Road Initiative, you can call it One Belt, One Road, you can call it Maritime Silk Road, but the basic idea is when the heartland, kind of tries to expand, the geography assigns the task to the major dreamland states to exercise some kind of restraint on this penetration. Once again, if you look at the geopolitical map of Asia, at least you have 2 major countries at the dreamland, that is India and Japan, and much concern about this kind of expansion of China and who could be potential or actual impediments. Now here, in this context, we might see, at least in perception, some kind of heartland, dreamland geopolitical game, no longer in Europe, but in Asia, and thereby different strategic cultures would be generated, and a sense of contest between India and China will continue to prevail. So there is one aspect that we might say that we must get rid of this kind of analysis, these geopolitical perceptions, but the problem is that this geopolitical perception exists, and this geopolitical perception actually colors our policy formulation. However, when you talk about prudence and maturity, maturity obviously can be exemplified by the actions of these countries now in post-Doklam phase. That is when we have this bullet train kind of infrastructure being installed in India. China is very much interested in selling its high-speed trains to India. So basically it is the idea that in whole business of even these geopolitical perceptions, you can look for business opportunities. The second analytical angle that I would like to develop is essentially of historical imagery. That is the kind of images that we harbor about each other. It is doubtful whether there could be any particular value, any particular kind of inner quality that can be termed essentially as Chinese or essentially as Indian. Basically we can always impose identities on different groups of people saying, look, they are like this. But whether they are like this or not, obviously, is a matter of debate, and often it's a matter of controversy. But when we talk about, for example, in case of India, India's military strategies, India's military doctrines, etc., we use terms like strategic restraint, strategic timidity even, and that means that these are essentially the expressions, in fact, of a strategic culture of non-domination. It could be a result of India's cultural heritage and historical experience that attaches much importance to convert hard power into soft power. Now, this is a pragmatic posturing, and obviously we don't have the time to go deep into it, but where a powerful kind of entity or hard power is expected to be magnanimous enough by adhering to a code of conduct in order to earn respect or soft power. That is, force can be used as an instrument, but then it must follow it, followed by some kind of human face of power. That is, there should be fair and just rules. And therefore, force have often been used in India, but it was hardly respected in true sense of the term. As we speak of non-violence, as we speak of non-domination, as we speak of non-interference, in a world of realpolitik, these terms apparently are found in the vocabulary of the weak. And therefore, it might, kind of encourage some misperception, might generate certain pattern of thinking on the other side of the border that India can be taught a lesson at will. So here we also have, kind of misperceptions generating some kind of policy environment in which certain policies can take place that might not have the desired results. While China, in fact, if we think of image of China, this image is essentially that of a rising power and probably a hard power that pursues pragmatic policies on the basis of cost-benefit analysis, where substance is more important than the procedure. In that kind of perception, obviously, and if we think in terms of its impressive record, China's rise with regard to its economic growth and military might, once again it suffers from image engineering. That its economic clout has made a number of friends, but hardly a number of allies. And thereby, if we look into Chinese behavior, once again there is this perception, that is what China claims is legitimate, as China would always say, but the browbeat the other claimants might hamper its image of a peaceful rise. So there would be, this is my second submission, that a contest between projected images, and that would influence strategic posturing of these two countries in the coming days. And these images would crystallize if the rewards of cooperation are not really evenly or fairly distributed. So there would always be a sense of competitive advantages that both countries would look for, and all these policies where there would not be some kind of even distribution of rewards, there would be tendency to project adversarial images, and this contest would go on. So these are the two problem areas I wanted to just emphasize. And here in this context, obviously there are many other avenues that one can think of to develop, to promote relations between the two countries. But these are two important areas, that is projected images and these kind of geopolitical perceptions, that are to be taken care of if we really want to have very meaningful and effective relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Madhukar. As always, you've raised several very critical issues and raised a lot of questions that need answering. I'd like to ask you, though, firstly, I wonder, frankly, whether geopolitics, which you mentioned several times, in fact, mutates to such a great extent. I mean, perhaps the political scenario does change quite greatly, but obviously the geographical imperatives do not. So I just want to read what Nehru said in 1942, "The future of which I dream is inextricably interwoven with close friendship and something almost approaching union with China." Now, to use your expression, would you say that was a misperception?
The basic idea is that perceptions change with time. At one point of time, you develop, you construct a particular narrative to give justification to a particular policy you have in mind. As time changes, you develop another narrative to justify the kind of policies that you like to make, that you can initiate. So basically, while on the one hand we can always emphasize on all the good things, all the rational, nice things in terms of our foreign policy posturing, on the other hand, the experience might lead us to kind of modify, alter this kind of images.
Okay, so we obviously have a third factor in this triangle. We have the geographical factor, we have the political factor, and we also have the time factor, which plays its part. I'd like to ask you, you remember in the 1930s, into the 1940s, the Indian National Congress, which was then the de facto government in a way, or government in waiting of the country, they consistently in their resolutions supported China against Japan. Now you have a situation in the 21st century where India seems to be supporting Japan against China. I know that's an oversimplification, but what would you make of this change?
Okay, if you think of the very, changes Indian foreign policy stances in 1950s, you go by Panchashil, you go by various stages, all right, early 1960s. And if you go by these stages, you would find that certain changes, have taken place because of the actual situation on ground. And therefore, in fact, it is not always prudent even to go back to history and bring back history and try to rectify history in contemporary period. It is, the essential idea is to find out the challenges, the kind of perceptions that was what was my theme essentially, the kind of perceptions that we harbor, and find out ways to kind of sideline or reduce the negative influences of those perceptions, and try to find out, areas that might lead us to have some kind of meaningful relationship. And at different, junctures of history, you would find different kind of positions adopted by states. So, for example, in post-Doklam phase, we are rebuilding our relations, and Panchashil has been referred to once again. So it doesn't mean that Panchashil has always been the guiding principles for these two states. So in a way, in fact, I didn't have that much of time to go into all these aspects, but the idea is one has to conform to the geopolitical, kind of attributes, and it depends on the abilities of the state, whether they can conform to it or whether they would refrain from conforming the geographical attributes that can be used for national ends.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Jamsa Jasin, you want to speak from there?
Namaste. आप लोगों को मिलकर बहुत खुशी हुई. I arrived in Delhi a month ago, so I'm a newcomer to India. On the other hand, my fascination with this country goes back to my childhood, when students were encouraged to follow Monkey King's example to smash an old world and create a new one. My family lived in a city not far from Shaolin Temple, where I was addicted to the story of Bodhidharma and Shaolin Kung Fu, with no idea that India would become an inseparable part of my life in the years to come. In fact, no matter what my life dream was, without the normalization of India-China diplomatic and cultural relations, Beijing University would not have renewed its Hindi teaching program in 1979. As a result, I would have no chance to be here with everyone today. As I see it, activities like this symposium can provide more opportunities for students to be interested in China-Indian culture and history, or make it means of living in the future, as I did in the past. For this reason, I want to say Bahut Dhanyavad to the institutions and persons who organized this symposium and wish it a success. With job responsibilities to enhance cultural exchange and friendship between China and India, I'm honored to be invited to attend this symposium. Consider myself a new friend of yours and an old friend of India. When I was young, my knowledge about India came from children's picture books, some based on historical documents like stories of Fa Xian and Xuanzhuang, some more legendary like Journey to the West. The image of Monkey King has entertained and inspired many generations in China. Today, some scholars are trying to connect Monkey King with Hanuman. Whatever the fact is, the links between China and India were strong, as evidenced by rich cultural heritage preserved in both countries, by the great number of worshippers of Buddhist temples all over China. Those picture books told me that as early as 2 millennia ago, pilgrims, envoys, merchants, and travelers started to come and go between China and India. Their experiences stimulated me to be interested in Indian culture and history, and eventually guided me to work here as cultural counselor till the end of my personal career. In my case, it seems that karma or karma does exist and sometimes can see one's fate. The Chinese people have always imagined India as wonderland, Western paradise, pure land, ideal world, and considered cultural exchanges to be mutually beneficial. In ancient times, China learned a lot from India, tangible and intangible, including sugar making, and then refined the technology. I wonder whether that's why sugar is called jini in Sanskrit. When ancient India imported tea from China and then made Darjeeling black tea one of India's most important export products. Those picture books have convinced me that China and India were good neighbors and coexisted in peace for thousands of years. They contained more jini than bitter and pain, more cooperation than conflict, more mutual appreciation than dislike. And the importance of cultural exchange in China-India history can never be overestimated. Today, we are luckier than our ancestors. After a few hours' flight, we can shake each other's hands without bearing the hardship Xuanzang went through for his journey to Tianzhu, an ancient name for India that is still used a lot in China. Before I came here last month, I was amazed to know Indian archaeologists have identified the sites of some ancient cities based on Xuanzang's book. I once worked with my Indian colleagues of the Archaeological Survey of India to organize an Indian antiquity exhibition touring 4 museums in China in 2006, provided an opportunity for more Chinese visitors to better understand the Indian history and culture, and made a highlight of my personal life with that. Talking about present China-Indian cultural relations, I'm pleased to see many people are working hard to seek the way to bring China and India together in the right direction and bring happiness and benefit for the common people. I firmly believe the bright future of China and India, the happiness and benefits of their people, will depend on how our two nations live with each other, depend on how to develop our relations as good neighbors, partners, and friends. That's the only reasonable and realistic choice lies ahead of us. That's the only way to make win-win for both, not lose-lose for all. Not long ago, Indian movie Dangal gained a complete victory in China, with box office receipts of over $200 million, much higher than that of its domestic market. A historian once mentioned to me that culture is always stronger than knife and sword. For instance, every time China was invaded in history, China was the final winner due to its rich culture, indicating soft power is stronger to win people's hearts. The name of the road by the Chinese embassy in Delhi is Panchashir. In China, few people know Panchashir, but 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and India's great contributions for non-aligned movement are widely known. One reason I think why China has developed comparatively faster than many countries in the world is that China has insisted on those principles in the past decades, and I'm among the millions of people who have benefited from that. After over 30 years peaceful development, the living standard of common people in China has reached a level higher than they expected. What is our goal for tomorrow? My optimism for the future of China and India comes from our history and culture. The West still dominates the world in many ways through its worldwide media network and other powers. And we have actually benefited a lot from Western inventions like BRICS and Chindia. The BRICS is moving ahead as expected, and Chindia will definitely surprise the world in the days to come. Hindi has its own charm I love, and sometimes I lose myself. Girl can be yesterday as well as tomorrow. Wherever we go tomorrow, we should focus on what we do today. In some sense, focus on making yesterday once more, when Hindi Jini Pai Pai, and we should always be. Thank you.
Mr. Young, you know, my figures may be completely out of date, but as far as I read, and as I said, this may be a few years out of date, China has more than 100 million tourists going abroad every year. They go mainly to certain countries where they feel at home, certainly. But 100 million is a huge figure. The number who come to India was, at that time, 150,000. What do you think, and the number of Indians going to China is 700,000. Of course, obviously, we will learn much more from each other if people visit each other more. 700,000 Indians going to China is quite reasonable, but 150,000 Chinese coming to India is very low. What do you think India can do to make India more attractive for Chinese tourists?
That's a very good question, and sometimes I think that question myself for quite a long time. Not long ago, I mentioned that to one of my friends who work here as the representative of Chinese Bureau of Tourism, and he raised the same question to me. And I think, from bottom of heart, many Chinese love Indian culture, and there are so many world cultural heritage sites and so many places which are worth seeing. And but unfortunately, compared with even compared with China, the infrastructure here, there is a big space to improve. And some people come here, some people like going to museums or cultural heritage sites, but not all of them. So I think there's more room to cooperate with each other, and I'm quite sure when the relations between the two countries is improving, and there will be more and more Chinese tourists come to India. I'm quite sure of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit surprised you didn't mention the four-letter word, visa, but never mind. Okay, I think the time has come to open the floor to a very patient audience. Please ask your question, indicate who you want to answer it.
In other continents, like in Europe, Germany is the dominant country because of its economy, and in America, it's the United States. Like that, do you foresee like China becoming a magnet, economic magnet, where all the Asian countries coalesce around, like United States and Germany?
I've been asked to group a few questions together, so another question, please. Sir. No, this gentleman there.
One question each for Professor Mitro and Professor Majumdar. I begin, Professor Mitro. Thank you, madam, for your presentation. You talked about yoga, you talked about culture, and another important aspect where perhaps India and China is cooperating is in the domain of sports. When I talk about sports, I talk about sports such as badminton and table tennis, where Chinese sporting multinationals are playing an eminent role in promoting these sports to India. And Professor Majumdar, how would an offensive realist visualize the growing Sino-Indian cooperation? And when you talk about offensive realism, more often than not, chances of misperceptions and miscalculations come in. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. No, we can hear you.
Professor Shravani Mitra, just two questions. I think that I would like to ask for your opinion. If we take the Austric Dravidian, older language, and then Sanskrit, and this kind of linguistic ethnic division will reconcile with the growing dissatisfaction among certain countries in Southeast Asia or in the inter-region. So this will be a better method of treating India, China in the bigger context. And second question, very short question. This is, I'm a trained Buddhologist also, and I would like to, in fact I'm now teaching after my retirement in Calcutta University's Buddhist studies. I'm thinking that China has been very successful in whatever Mahayana Buddhism. Now Theravada Buddhism is of course in the context of South and Southeast Asia more important. And I would like to suggest, how would you react to, you have referred to Tagore. Tagore had a very nice vision of retranslating not only Mahayana Buddhist texts, retranslated into Sanskrit, lost texts. And no one talks about it. And also, I would like to hear from my Chinese colleague, what do you think about Sanskrit Indological studies? Because I know that your scholars are very expert in that.
All right, economics is very important, obviously there is no doubt about it. But the idea is what I was just trying to, kind of present there. The economic rewards are to be shared in a just and proper manner. If economic rewards benefit one particular party, there would be definitely some kind of reaction from the other side. If there is huge trade imbalance, for example, there will be reactions from the other side. And that reaction, the point that I was trying to make, would reinforce the images that we have about each other, the adversarial images. Now, obviously, there is one kind of analysis that in contemporary period, there is a disjunction between logic of economics and logic of security. But the idea is that at one level, you just cannot pursue one at the cost of the other. So the idea is that economic factor is dominant. Obviously, in contemporary situation, with all our plans to develop India, make in India, things like that, Chinese investment in Indian startup programs, there are a number of avenues that can be pursued. Obviously, that is mutually beneficial. I was just referring to the other aspect as well, that it stays there at the background and can any point of time, because of some adversaries, can come to the forefront and influence our policy making. That was what I was just trying to say. I was not talking about offensive realism, and if you have any question on offensive realism, on Mearsheimer or whatever, clear it with Shivashish. There is the chances of misperception, yes. There is always this chances of misperception leading to some kind of conflict, some kind of unwanted warfare. But well, even Freud would say that it's intellect that is better than instinct, and therefore as human beings we can always exercise our intellect over our instinctive decisions. And there actually this maturity, the prudence, this the kind of pragmatism would come in and would obviously formulate our policies. Policies are not formulated following certain prescriptions by certain scholars. Thank you.
In terms of the Sanskrit, I'm happy to see in recent years Sanskrit become popular among scholars in China. In many universities, even some students study Sanskrit. One reason is that in history, after Xuanzang's trip to India, and he brought back with him a lot of manuscripts, and those Buddhist manuscripts were translated into Chinese. And I was told that some of the original pieces were lost in India, but they are well preserved in China. So that's a valuable historical documents, and I think those documents will be useful for today's purpose. Thank you.
I think the first one from you was more a comment, but let me just add by saying that sports is one area between India and China where a lot of cooperation is possible and should happen. And it's not, it's interesting to note that games like badminton, which is now actually a stronghold of both the countries. I mean, it's a sphere of competition really. But having said that, there are other areas of sports where there could be cooperation. For instance, China is, I think, now very keen to make its mark maybe in the next decades or so in cricket. I think some amount of coaching has already begun, so we could perhaps contribute to that. Coming to Professor here, you see, I agree with you completely that to overcome and bridge this gap of the linguistic barrier is very important. It's extremely important. But you know, China has had a very strong tradition of translation. It also has a very strong tradition of written down history, so and also preservation. They are phenomenal in that, and ours is an oral tradition. It's a, you know, Shruti, Smriti and Kriti. That's the way we follow. That's the tradition. It's always Shruti first in the ancient Indian tradition, I'm saying. So what I'm trying to say is, if we look at Buddhist texts going to China, the Chinese actually invented dictionaries and they translated huge number of texts. And yes, it is a responsibility of we Indians in the present times, perhaps to translate some of them back, which are completely lost. But Buddhist studies interaction is one very sorely, sadly missed area of cooperation between the two countries. So therefore, very few and far between kind of, you know, numbers that we see occasionally scholars from Buddhist studies who are wanting to go, but it's a lifetime kind of a vocation. It's a investment of a lifetime, and in our times there aren't many who are ready to, and especially our next generation, ready to make that. So I don't know if that answers your.
The gentleman at the back, can you stand up, please? Yeah, thanks.
So my question to you is, sir, presently at this junction, so my question to you.
To whom?
Sir, Ambassador.
No, I don't take questions.
He's chair.
So anybody else?
Sum up.
Professor, what do you think presently, how does Indo-Japanese relation shape the Sino-Indo relation, be it conflict or cooperation? Because we know
That's okay. We've understood.
Finish that up?
Yes, go ahead.
few days before the Doklam standoff issue was resolved, there was a statement claiming that we support India's claims in the Doklam issue. So how do you think Indo-Japanese relation at this juncture shape Indo-Sino relation when it comes to be conflict or cooperation?
He's the right person.
Okay, you know, I was trying to talk about these geopolitical perceptions, and I was trying to give it a picture of heartland-rimland contest. So the rimland states would definitely cooperate against the heartland when they are concerned about the expansion of the heartland. So in a way, it was expected that Japan would stand with India on that particular, you know, Doklam issue, because Japan has its own problems in South China Sea as well. All right. So therefore, it's not really a question of how India and Japan, you know, their relations would have shaped India-China relations, because India might like to act as a bridge, India might like to be balanced in its approach and things like that. So all these issues are essentially subject to diplomatic bargaining at any given point of time. So it is not really friendship with one would definitely be at the cost of friendship with another. But the idea is, if you take that geopolitical kind of framework of analysis, then it happens in that particular way, and the perception influences our policy making.
Sorry, we've got to conclude now. We're already running 5 minutes beyond schedule, and I'll be in very hot water with the ICS if I don't terminate. So I'd like to basically thank Professor Majumdar, always very interesting to speak to. Mr. Jiang, thank you so much for coming from Delhi and allowing us to hear your views on cultural cooperation. We all hope that ties will be stronger as time goes by. And thank you so much, Professor Mitro, for coming and speaking to us on a wide range of subjects, including yoga, Bollywood, and the various other linguistic and other cultural ties that bring us together. My apologies for running over time, Ravi, but now it's up to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Lieutenant General Mukherjee. It's a pleasure to be amongst you today, and I must thank the organizers for having invited me. We have a slightly reduced panel. Dr. Sri Radha Datta is not available this afternoon, so it's just the three of us. You've got Professor Bhutalingam, who has already been introduced to you and has spoken in the morning. And he's actually a renowned authority on the subject we've been speaking. And on my left, you have Dr. Vinoda Mishra, who is again quite an authority on China. They'll both be speaking on various aspects. I'm going to hand over to them. My background is, I've dealt with the People's Liberation Army for the last 55, 60 years. So I look at it from a soldier's perspective, which I give later. Over to Dr. Bhutalingam.
Good afternoon. Thank you once again, Chairman and hosts. My perspective, as you will see from the title of my talk, is about language and thought. And I'm going to address a very simple question, that if two languages are very similar, or two languages are very dissimilar, what does it imply for the way of thinking of the people who speak those languages? If they are similar, what does it imply? If they are dissimilar, what does it imply? And I'm going to follow that through with a few conclusions. And I suspect in this panel and amongst you there will be a very lively discussion, because some of those are quite, I would say, maybe controversial or even quite disruptive. Now, I'm going to start with the assumption that, of course, India has a lot of languages. So I'm going to start with a simplifying assumption that at least for 80% of the people of India, roughly speaking, give or take a few liberties, I'm going to treat Sanskrit as the root language of around that number of Indian people. And as far as China is concerned, we needn't take that many liberties, but we have to take a few. I'm going to assume that Mandarin Chinese is the root language of the inhabitants of at least 80% of China, if not more. It's a little simplified there in the case of China, because the character, the Chinese character, is indeed common to all of China. Whatever language you speak in the regions, you all understand the written character. Now, if you look at Sanskrit, it is very different from Mandarin. First of all, Sanskrit is an alphabetic language. And an alphabetic language means a language which there are discrete rules in constructing the language. Sanskrit has a very strong and very complex grammar, which Panini had put down, and school children all over the country and abroad struggle for years to master Sanskrit grammar. Mandarin, on the other hand, has a very simplified grammar. It has no gender, it has no tense, it has no singular or plural, it has no mood, it has no case, it has no declination. So, grammatically, Mandarin could not be more different from Chinese. The other thing, of course, is Sanskrit is a language which is with a particular alphabetic vocabulary. Chinese is an ideographic language with images. What could be more different than that? Neurologically, biological science has shown that an alphabetic language like Sanskrit is interpreted by the left side of your brain, whereas a picture or a pattern or a drawing is interpreted by the right side of your brain. That also matters. So when you read or write or hear Sanskrit or any Sanskritic language, you're using your left brain, and when you do the same with your Chinese, you're actually using both sides because you're seeing the pattern and you also hear the sound that is there. That's another difference. So, does this all matter? Well, there's a field called psycholinguistics, which started many years ago, which studied differences in languages and what that means. Very broadly, they started off by a theory by Sapir and Wolf, which said if languages are very different, then the thinking of those people who speak those languages is very different. Then Noam Chomsky came along, he's now grand old age of 98 or 93, and he gave the opposite theory, that no, there is something called a universal language deeply embedded in the brain of everybody, and therefore that is what Sapir and Wolf said is not true. But to cut a long story short, today, modern psycholinguistics veers around to a sort of compromise between the two, veering slightly in favor of Sapir and Wolf, that indeed there is a difference. And they explain it using modern computer software. That whether you load in onto your computer, whether you have Android system or iOS or whatever it is, all these softwares do the same thing. They can do graphics, they can do language, they can do images, presentations and so on. But there are some competences which are a little more advanced in one and a little less in the other, and vice versa. iOS does some things better, Android does some things better, and so on. They are not huge differences, they are small differences. But at the margin, those small differences matter. If you are running a 100 meters race, then even 0.1 of a second matters. So, an alphabetic language and a pattern language have certain strengths and certain weaknesses, again seen in this relative manner. My colleague Dr. Mitra earlier talked of the oral tradition of India and the imagery or visual tradition of China. That is again obvious because Sanskrit enables that. And you can play a lot with the language. Sanskrit grammarians love playing with the language. In Sanskrit you can keep joining words. You have Nari and you have Ardhanari and Ardhanarishwara, Ardhanarishwara Sthiti, and you can go on, a sentence becomes this long. Chinese, each sentence is that, one character, 2 characters, a poem is 4 characters. So, the way you put together thought is very different. The Chinese grammarians also, having produced a sentence this long, then they sliced it up and they played with it. And they produce some remarkable stuff like a Ramayana which you can read both ways, going forward and going backwards also. Now, what is the result of all that? The result of all that is a facility of playing with the symbols, which has led to what? I propose it has led to our great facility to develop computer software, develop logic, which is highly developed in Sanskrit. Chinese, on the other hand, not they didn't do well in maths, but there was a different field. They specialized in the field of abstract reasoning, in Zen, in koans, in holistic thinking. One of the great Chinese thinkers produced a riddle to which this day has not been solved. And the riddle is by a person called Kung Sung Lun. A white horse is not a horse. Please think about this, you'll spend a sleepless night, but think about it if you can solve it. A white horse is not a horse. Those of you who have got Wikipedia can look it up. Now, so all these kinds of differences in the language gave rise to some very interesting things. That the way the languages are constructed, you have different strengths, as I said. And some of those strengths, for example, I gave you software and hardware as one of them. But they are also manifest in many other possibilities that are coming alive today. For example, when you have pattern thinking, then you obviously have possibilities of looking at structures. Chinese are very good at structural chemistry, very good at architecture in many ways. Again, I'm talking relatively, it's not 0 and 100, it's that fine difference. Indians are very good at software. Indians are very good at combinatorial chemistry, where you kind of wrap genes around and do all kinds of stuff in manipulating numbers. So one of the conclusions that one comes to, and this is also supported by management science, is that when things are different, it is not necessarily conflictual. It can be highly creative. The most creative teams by modern companies are put together by a diversity of people. Not people who think together, not people who think the same, but people who think differently. In Silicon Valley is so creative because you have very crazy individuals there of very many sizes and shapes. You have to put them together to get creative thinking. So the possibility of highly creative thinking in combining the competences of China and India in these two categories, because of the strengths of the language, is a possibility which I think we have ignored. It is a huge potential lying there which has been ignored and which put together can lead to great opportunities in the future. These opportunities should be seized because rather than looking at short-term areas of conflict like the border or whatever it is, because nobody is really going to go to war on this as we've seen recently, the two countries are going to be the biggest losers in a greater war to come. And that war has already started. That is the war of Mother Nature versus humanity. And in that humanity of 7.5 billion, Indians and Chinese are 2.5 billion, 1/3. So, what could be the possibilities in India and China creatively engaging with this kind of potential that I have pointed out in looking at climate change, in looking at environment, in looking at areas which have remained unsolved, like the medicines to cure dengue or chikungunya or malaria, which are taking a toll in our cities even today as we speak, or water scarcity, water stress. We are all going to be afflicted by that very, very soon. This, in fact, strangely enough, was pointed out, not now, but over 2,000 years ago by the first travelers, and the cultural counselor referred to this, when Xuanzang and Faxian came to India, or Bodhidharma went to China, they actually looked at all this and they saw the creative potential in engaging with each other. And the creativity that came out at that time is still unrivaled. Buddhism went from here to China, but the Buddhism that finally got rooted in China was neither Indian, nor was it originally reflecting Confucianism or Taoism, but it was a new type of Buddhism which reflected the genius of China. So something new had emerged between these two cultures. So it is possible through the application of very strong differences in the way of thinking to apply those differences constructively and creatively rather than conflictually. And this is the pathway that the study of culture and history teaches us, is a possibility and a huge potential. And If I have to quote another historian, Arnold Toynbee said that challenges are posed to nations all the time. Those nations that respond to the challenges survive and grow. Those nations which fritter them away, either internal conflict or external conflict, are part of the civilizations that die and are never heard of again. India and China stand therefore on the brink of that choice, and I sincerely hope, along with the rest of you, I hope that both countries will make the right set of choices going forward. Thank you very much indeed.
That was a wonderful talk, Professor Buttalingam. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us. I now hand over to Professor Mishra, who will cover the next subject.
Thank you, General. Good afternoon, everybody. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to say a few words. In fact, this is a topic I have spoken many times, particularly in this particular room. So there is nothing new from my side. Only if the students are new, then I would sound new, or else I'm pretty old in this. So I think many specifics have been spoken by the previous speakers. The possibilities that are there, the untapped possibilities, and the optimism my previous speaker spoke about, all these are there. But what I propose to do now is to look at this India-China relationship in the broader context. And from there probably we'll get an answer that why these potentials are not translating into realities. Where lies the problem? I'm not a man from either history or from culture. Being a student of security studies, I would be confined to strategic analysis. So let me begin with this concept that the emerging world order. What is this emerging world order? It's not a fact that there was no world order before this. There was a world order, and which changed, or which kind of collapsed all on a sudden with the collapse of Soviet Union, giving rise to a phase of uncertainties, wherein if we import Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolution, in the realm of IR paradigms, it is a stage of crisis where many alternative models are competing with each other to be established as the dominant paradigm. What are those alternative models? We talk about unipolarity, we talk about bipolarity, we talk about multipolarity. I think all these three are possibilities with some degree of relevance. Now, if we are talking about unipolarity as a possibility, then what kind of world order are we looking at? Clearly, that the old notion that United States would remain at the top of this unipolar world, or will be the only pole, seems to be bit doubtful, because not because of any other factor. If there are other factors, the primary factor is that United States doesn't seem to be any longer interested in holding on to that particular position. It is retreating. It is clearly on a path of retreating. So if United States retreats, who is the other player, possible player, can play this role of the single pole in the international system? Undoubtedly it is China. Now that is one possibility, please keep in mind. The second possibility is a kind of bipolar world order, replacing the earlier bipolar world order. Then who are going to be the players? Russia is not a possibility for a long time. United States, if it remains somewhat interested in to be engaged, to remain in the responsible position, it can remain as one pole, and the other pole is undoubtedly again China. Now, these two are the kind of more probable alternatives than the other alternative that I am going to talk about now. That is probably many people's expectation or analysis even, that the world is no longer going to be unipolar or multipolar. It is going to be unipolar or bipolar, it is going to be multipolar. If it is a multipolar society, a multipolar world order, there you will get an opportunity to find many other players, and India might figure in one of them. So what I'm trying to tell here is that we're talking a lot about India-China relationship and its relevance or its impact on world order. We just see that if there are three models that we think of, one is unipolarity, one is bipolarity, or one is multipolarity. It is only if there is a multipolar international order that emerges, we find some relevance of India in it. If it becomes a unipolar world, India is not relevant. If it is a bipolar world, India is not relevant. So why are we talking so much about India-China relationship? Are they actually at a position where we can compare them, or we can say that they are at the same level? I certainly don't think. Look at where China stands now. It's the number 2 economy, militarily number 2, and look at its capacities. Look at its strategy. The way the Chinese are thinking. This Belt Road initiative that Professor Majumdar was talking about. Look at the scale of strategic thinking that China is daring to have. Look at China's engagement all over the world, and look at India's engagements. Look at India's strategic vision. It doesn't cross Pakistan. It is yet to go beyond Pakistan. So what are we talking about? Are we actually talking about two equal powers? Are we actually talking about two equal powers? One, that is China, which is seriously thinking about becoming a global power. Please remember this entire Belt and Road policy, initiative, the Chinese are planning to complete it by the year 2049. Does anything sound familiar? 2049 will be the 100th year of the success of Chinese communist revolution. So they wish to prove to the world that the communist China is assuming its original position of being the middle kingdom, and they are pursuing it with vigor. Now talk about India. What are we trying to do? What is our strategic vision for 2050? I don't think we have a clear-cut vision where we wish to see ourselves. Of course, we lack capability. That's why our vision is also blurred. So let's not kind of pretend that we are uncompetitive, power with China. While the Chinese are seriously pursuing their, superpower ambitions, we are enamored if we are called that we have aspirations, if we are told that we have aspirations to become a superpower or an important power. Whenever the United States says that we used to see India playing a bigger role in the United Nations, we become happy. Because in rhetorics we wish to remain as superpower. We are doing nothing to become a superpower. So in that context, India has very little relevance in the emerging world, at least as things stand now. Now then, is there any relevance in talking about India-China relations? Yes, even if India is not relevant in the emerging international order right now, there's still India-China relationship matter. Why does it matter? Let's not forget that these two countries are the largest countries of the world, both having a billion plus population. And the phenomenon which the world is excited and at the same time anxious about is the simultaneous rise of these two countries. And political mathematicians have calculated, based on historical facts, that the reason why Europe took over the leadership from India and China in the 17th and 18th century is because of the effect of industrial revolution, which caused some unprecedented development in Europe. And in that comparison, the kind of development India and China are embarking upon in a century, India and China are going to, overthrow the current dominant powers out of the center. So in that scenario, when that actually happens, what kind of international scenario will emerge? That's a century after. But even then, there are worries. Because these two countries, if they come to the center of, the global world order, the order will be established, the order will be, reflective of the relationship India and China share. Now, what kind of relationship they can share in between them? Professor Majumdar, gave us, what matters in shaping these relationships. But I would be very practical and, just end up with one thing. There are a lot of conjectures that, a lot of suggestions that there should be cooperation, and we see the media frenzy that happens whenever there is an issue, talking about war and all those competition and all that. And there are possibilities of cooperation. But the fact remains that India and China can never cooperate, in the true sense of the term. That means, what Ambassador Srinivasan was saying, that what Nehru was talking about, that it should be a kind of union. That kind of cooperation will never be there between India and China. Why not? One is a cliche that, two countries, if they consider themselves to be, if they're superpowers, either established or even aspiring, are bound to compete. It has never happened that two superpowers, have cooperated with each other. It never happens. Second is much more practical. Both India and China house 1 billion plus population and are yet to provide their citizens with a lifestyle which is comparable to the developed world. And in order to achieve that kind of lifestyle and level of development, both India and China need enormous amount of resources, which neither China nor India possess with them. So they have to go out in search of resources and in search of various kinds of resources. So this will bring them to a competitive meeting more often than a cooperative meeting. I haven't seen any instance where India and China have cooperated except on two occasions. One is, when they jointly fought the international community to retain their right to pollute the environment. That is one instance. And the second is in few odd cases of oil field acquisitions where they collaborated not because of any kind of philanthropic attitude towards each other. Without those particular collaborations in those particular instances, those oil fields couldn't be explored. That's the only reason. And even there is a lot of discrepancy in the payoffs of both India and China. So that remains the reality, whether you accept it or not. So we have to see to it. The only thing that we can see to it that the competitive relationship that we are going to continue with for a long period of time, we have to see to it that it doesn't escalate into a conflictual situation. And I think that level of maturity is there in India-China relationship, and we got a fresh evidence on this Doklam issue. I was being contacted by many people who are interested in it and consider us as slightly knowledgeable on this. They were quite anxious. I kept telling them that this is not going to escalate into a war, because India and China are at least that much mature to understand that war is not a solution to their border dispute. So I'm at least happy that India-China relationship is not escalating into a conflictual situation. But please remember that the cooperation will be there, but that will never define India-China relationship. If you are going to assess the relationship between India and China, it is always going to be conflictual, competitive. I'll give you last example why I call it competitive, and the kind of cooperation, even if the cooperation is visible in some spheres, why I don't call it cooperation. The most often cited data is trade data, that India, China are trading at a very high level, and China has become India's number one trading partner. Tell me which two countries assess their bilateral relationship on the basis of trade. If that is the fact, China and United States are trading in excess of $400 billion. So they should be the best of friends. Is it a fact? Can you say that China and the United States are the best of the friends? Do you know the trade figures between Japan and China? It is around $300 billion. Are the best of friends? So trade never defines, interstate relations. And adding to that, look at the level of investment in each other. That speaks about the trust on each other. If you look at the mutual trade figures, it is abysmal. Chinese investment in India is not even 1% of India's FDI. And this 1% is the accumulation in last 3-4 years. Prior to that, it was 0.01%. And India's investment in China is even lower. Why is it so? We still do not trust the Chinese and do not allow them to invest in certain sectors which we call as sensitive sectors. And the Chinese do not allow the Indian investors in certain areas which they call as sensitive areas. So that is the spirit of India and China towards each other, and that is not going to go away. And it's not my perspective, and it is not an Indian perspective that we see China and Chinese are competitors. The Chinese also see it that way, because I'll end by this, if General allows me. The Chinese have their own assessment of the international system. They have assessed the threats that are going to come in future from various countries, and they prepared this white paper long ago. There is a saying in China about the Chinese that they plan very long, and the example is very interesting. I have shared it many times and don't mind sharing it once again. It is said that in 1936, the famous French journalist André Marleau interviewed Chairman Mao and asked him, what does he think about the French Revolution? And Chairman Mao is supposed to have told André Marleau that it is too early to say. So that long the Chinese have their vision and planning. So keeping that in mind, in 1993 the Chinese come out with a white paper, and prepared by the CWC. That the title of that white paper was very interesting. That can Chinese army win the next war? So in that there was a thorough security threat assessment, and they had given security threat levels to few countries. And I will just tell who are the countries figured and what were the terminologies used by the Chinese. The list was topped by United States, and the terminology was used as number one adversary. United States is China's number one adversary. Now the second position was occupied by Japan, and the terminology was used as resurgent adversary. The third position was occupied by Russia, and the terminology was used as still potential adversary. The fourth position was occupied by India, but I will not say that now. Let me say the fifth position. The fifth position was occupied by Vietnam, and the terminology was used unpredictable super killer. And the fourth position was occupied by India, and the terminology was used long-term potential adversary. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. That was very good. I'll take a few minutes, and if I may, give you a soldier's perspective. Shortly after I got my commission, my unit moved up to Western Bhutan to train the Royal Bhutan Army. And guess where we went? We sat at the Dolam Plateau for 4 spells of 3 months each, at the Dolam Plateau. And we patrolled from there regularly up to Yatung and even raided Yatung. During the entire period I was at the Dolam Plateau, which is 64-65 period, before the Pakistani war broke out, no nomads, no cattle herders, goat herders, or herdsmen, or shepherds came up to Dolam Plateau at all, or to Western Bhutan. It was only an afterthought thereafter, starting from 1967 onwards. So all that they claim that this has always been activated by us, the Dolam Plateau, is all nonsense actually. That's the reality of the situation. And just as a matter of interest, though it's not part of the subject, but I think you'd be interested to understand, the Chinese are at a severe disadvantage in the Chumbi Valley because India is on their expense. Any attack against those ridge lines is doomed to failure. Which is the main reason why the Chinese agreed to back down. But it's only a temporary backing down, let me tell you that as a soldier. I assure you they'll come back again, but through a different route. The Chinese don't give up that easily. Having watched the PLA, yes, they know there's no point in banging their head against a brick wall in that area. They'll do it by pressurizing the Bhutanese and get the Bhutanese to force the Bhutanese to give up Dolam Plateau and in exchange take some more territory elsewhere. That's probably, in my perception, what would happen. I've served in Aksai Chin, in the Chushul sector of Ladakh, in the Barahoti area, and the entire northeastern part, including Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal, on the Chinese border. I walked over more than 90% of it. I'm going to go across to a point which was given out by Dr. Bhutalinga and one of the other speakers, the question of oral and written traditions. It's very true. That's where we are suffering in relation to the border dispute, because we failed to record history. We've just failed to record history, whereas the Chinese have recorded history. And in that recorded history, it gives the details of where their shepherds and everybody used to move up to. I'll give you an example. When I was in Arunachal, did a seminar there at Itanak, and I caught hold of all the local from different tribes bordering the Tibetan border, and I asked them, I said, please tell us where your folklore says the border should be. And you will not believe it. Each one of them said, our tribe's border is 10 kilometers north of where it is now. In other words, we are claiming a border much south of what they claim, our own tribes claim, is their border. They say, what right does the Indian government have to give up our land? So what I requested Rajiv Gandhi University was, and I passed that point on to MEA and the Ministry of Home Affairs, I said, for God's sake, set up a department in the university which will record folklore. And therefore now they've started recording folklore, everything related to the boundary question. And I requested that other universities which relate to border areas must do the same also. The other aspect is strategic culture. I totally agree with Professor Mazumdar and Dr. Mishra. The Chinese psyche of being the Middle Kingdom is very much there. And based on that psyche, they've always throughout history followed an offensive philosophy, which they claim is defensive. It is preemptive, but it's actually offensive. That's part of the psyche, part of strategic culture of China, and very much applies to the People's Liberation Army and all their planning efforts. Unfortunately, on the Indian side, we have a defensive mentality. It's unfortunately come up as part of our psyche. Consequently, the Chinese look down on us a great deal, even though circumstances have changed a lot. Today, if the People's Liberation Army attempted an attack in various parts, they'd go back with a bloody nose. But the truth of the matter is that, and that is also reflected, with no offense meant to anybody, on our foreign policy. You have a National Security Council which does nothing. It is supposed to evolve policy. No policy is evolved there. At the moment, it revolves around the NSA. Nobody else. Or what the Prime Minister feels should be done. Terms are dictated from PMO to the Foreign Office, and policy is framed accordingly. So there's no real evolution of foreign policy at the moment, which is very unfortunate, and it is time that we evolve that culture. I'm sure there'd be disagreement with me on this point of view, but these are my observations on the issue over a long period of time. What's the truth really about Dolam? In reality, it was the army. Dolam is what we used to call it in the old days. Now you're all calling it Doklam, but it's actually Dolam in the correct pronunciation. The road building started, and the army then put across clearly to Delhi, the ball is in your court. If we don't block them, we are all in trouble. Don't blame us for it hereafter. Delhi was left with no option but to approve the army's decisions. That's the reality. There literally was no option in this matter. So, though the due credit must go to the Prime Minister of the country, but reality is slightly different to that. Now, when you look at India and China, if you want to look at areas of possible engagement, then you must understand the areas of disengagement. What are our quarrels with China? We have 1962 always at the back of our minds. We don't forget it easily. Nor do the Chinese for that matter. We also remember 1967 where we gave the Chinese a bloody nose. We also remember 1986-87 in the area of Guangdong, where again we gave them a difficult time. We also remember their frequent incursions all over. The Dolam Plateau, the war hysteria in the Chinese media and the Chinese hierarchy. And we look at the modernization of the PLA and the strategic infrastructure coming all over Tibet, which is really offensive in nature. The Middle Kingdom attitude and China's economic rise and strength. The constant support to Pakistan, which has been persistently part of the Chinese strategy to keep India down. And they've succeeded, mind you. Constant support to Pakistan, not allowing you to join the UN Security Council, not allowing you to become part of the nuclear suppliers group, colluding with Pakistan on J&K, terrorism, and nuclear proliferation. The OBOR itself passing through disputed areas and expecting India to join. That is the CPEC, Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Instigating smaller neighbors against India. The so-called philosophy of a string of pearls. The issue of Masood Azhar and their support and not allowing him to be declared a terrorist. The issue of the trade balance, the deficit. On the Chinese side, what do they see? Indian sanctuary to Dalai Lama. Their biggest worry in relation to India is Tibet. Secondly, India allowing Dalai Lama to visit Taiwan. US ambassador visiting Taiwan. All these issues. Constantly insisting India is interfering in Tibetan affairs. The border dispute. Cozying up to USA, Japan, Australia and Vietnam, South China Sea, not bowing down to China, are objecting to war and the BCIM EC, the BCIM Economic Corridor, Dolam, and the general poor opinion they have of India. Areas of engagement that you do have, once you remove these, you still have to try the trade route, but you have to remove the deficit. You have to remove the dumping of cheap Chinese goods. You have to try and resolve the Obor issue. And you have to continue trying to resolve the border dispute and relations in general and reduce tensions. And lastly, remove the issues related to UN Security Council, Azab and the US Affairs Group. That's really all I'd like to say, but we're open to questions. Anything you've got, please throw it across to any of the three of us.
Just one point. I congratulate and thank Institute of Child Studies and Jadavpur University for inviting me. I'm particularly happy that Professor Muthulingan has addressed the issue of knowledge share. Yeah, oh yes. No, just 2 minutes. Many of my students, because I have also addressed Jadavpur University several times, that Sanskrit and Chinese together made huge Mahayana texts, which are now in Göttingen University in Germany. And Waldschmidt was the Indologist, and Professor Vishwadev Mukherjee from Vishwabharati specialized on that. And now my very respected chairman, General Mukherjee, has also addressed this folklore tradition. There is huge manuscripts lying in Allahabad, Pune, and Benares, and in Calcutta, several places in Sanskrit. And if old China and India several thousands years ago could develop a synthetic language of Sanskrit Chinese, it is Sanskrit Chinese. And mind you, the name of Waldschmidt, who showed how the manuscripts can be joined, how this language developed. And I would like to thank also General Mukherjee and Dr. Mishra. And I think if we talk about Tagore all the time, and I am now 65, I was born in Shantiniketan. I have seen Dr. Khan and I know his mission. He worked with my father, sorry to say something personal, and I have seen the dedication of these people. So to my students again, I have come here mainly for the students, and thank you Professor Lahiri also to send another reminder. I think this is high time that if countries like Germany and now China and Holland also, International Institute of Asian Studies, they can make use of our past. Why can't we be in India? Thank you very much.
Could we have one or two more questions before we start giving the answers? Yes, please.
Good evening. I have a question to Dr. Orari Buthalingan. You, sir, spoke about the language. Now, Confucius institutes China as a part of their policy. They have started in last couple of years in Bombay and I think some few technology institutes. One of their strategy is starting this Confucius institutes, and I'm given to understand there are about 100 odd around the world. In India about 3-4 places, and I believe Calcutta is also going to have one. What reciprocal are we doing anything from Indian side towards them? Thank you.
I think it's possibly better to take a few questions and then.
The gentleman at the back, then the lady after that.
This is for Professor Mishra. You mentioned about the unipolar, bipolar, multipolar world scenario. my thesis is that the United States and the West in particular, as general, will remain for a long time as a dominant force in the world, not because of economic or military reasons, primarily because of their monopoly of knowledge, scientific knowledge and knowledge as such, and the institutions which have come up after the Enlightenment period in the West. So those institutions have not been replicated either in India nor in China. Japan wanted to replicate them in the Meiji Restoration, but not fully. So long as the West has a monopoly on knowledge, it will remain the dominant power in the world. What your response is?
Any other questions? Yes. Last one, now we'll start answering.
Thank you, Chair, for recognizing me. My question is to Lieutenant General J.R. Mukherjee. I want to know the army perspective. If we want to negotiate the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is passing through Gilgit-Baltistan, this is a Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. If we negotiate and make it pass through Indian-occupied Kashmir, what are the structural implications of it? My second question to you is, sir, how active are the Indian intelligence agencies in, like the Defense Intelligence Agency in China, and how much information we get about the National People's Council and the State Council functioning from China? And my third question to you is to you, sir. You told about giving China a bloody nose, so you make me feel very proud that our army is so empowered to take strategic steps against China. So I want to ask you that is India capable enough of conducting a surgical strike of the nature we conducted in Myanmar or even in Pakistan occupied Kashmir in China in the future if the need arises? Thank you so much, sir.
Sorry. Ambassador Srinivas.
It's actually just a comment to Dr. Mishra. You were speaking about the impossibility of superpowers coming together. Superpowers is an expression which is really post-Second World War. We're looking at Cold War and post-Cold War. And I think that we've never had any examples of superpowers coming together because we've never had a situation where, in fact, there have been two which haven't been in conflict. So I think that's a little premature. The second thing is that when you projected your view of China up to 2050 or so, I think you correctly said that they're likely to be the biggest economy. That's, I think, very likely to be true. But I think it's also likely to be true that the USA will be the strongest military power for the foreseeable future. So I think we've got a problem here, that it's not going to be a situation where you have a combined economic and military superpower as a unique power, but you're going to have a very difficult situation with one country being the preeminent economy, the other country being the preeminent military power. So this is going to be a very peculiar situation in the world, and we've not seen the like of it before. It's going to be very difficult to predict what the outcome will be.
Thank you. Professor Bhashwati Bhattacharya raised a question.
My name is
Shopna. You raised a very interesting point of knowledge sharing. Knowledge sharing is relevant not only in the ancient past, it's very relevant today for the success of any country. And it's dramatically proven by today's interconnected economy. Now take this. This is an iPhone. Most likely this is manufactured in China. It has got about 1,000 components. Components come from Japan, from Taiwan, from various parts of Southeast Asia. Software is controlled largely in the United States, and so is the trade name. And the bulk of the profits go to the United States. But just suppose something were to happen in the South China Sea and this stopped. None of us, whoever has iPhones here, would not have an iPhone. So this is an example of knowledge transfer and is also an example of competition and cooperation living together. Because there is intense cooperation amongst these countries to produce this, there is also intense competition. So it is actually, I would like to question the logic that competition and collaboration cannot go together. They all go together. Take sports people. They compete on the sports field. Otherwise they are collaborating where the interests of the game are concerned. Take scientists. They are fiercely competing to win the Nobel Prize. They are also competing, collaborating as far as colleges and education is concerned. So there is a competition and collaboration. Unless they go together, no nation can succeed. This is what's happening between China and the US, which is adversary number, eternal adversary. They are collaborating. 200,000 American students in China, reverse in America, investment, trade, what have you. Japan, the resurgent adversary, historical enemy of China. Collaboration, 6 million Chinese tourists in Japan, investment, trade, R&D, enormous collaboration. Russia and China, we don't need to talk about it. I mean, they are the new best friends on the block. So it's happening all over the world. So we have to really wake up and see and play the same game. Of course we will compete. We are too big to not compete. We must also collaborate. We cannot ignore the second largest economy in the world. If we do, it will be at the cost of our own development. So this is a game of collaboration, cooperation. Historically, those who have played it have won. Those who could not play it have gone, as Toynbee said, those civilizations have collapsed. Now coming to the second question on Confucius institutes. Now India actually has got no official Confucius institutes. Most agreements that China has with the official governments of the other to set up Confucius institutes in the universities of those other countries. India has not agreed. What India has are some Confucius institutes set up in private universities like Vellore and so on. Yes. And they are part of private arrangement where they operate. But there are no institutes, Confucius institutes in official Indian university. There are incidentally more than 500 Confucius institutes all over the world, and the plan is to expand it to more than 1,000 to spread not only the language but Chinese culture and the general way of thinking. And lastly, on the superpower collaboration, I think Ambassador Srinivasan mentioned this point. Two examples strike me in the time of the US-Soviet Cold War. One is the strategic arms limitation talks and all the talks about hotline and keeping the danger of nuclear conflagration kind of under check. And today some stories are coming out about how there were some near misses. But it's remarkable that in 50 years of Cold War, nothing bad happened. So that is one example. And the second example, again, US-Soviet, is the space collaboration. What started off as a huge rivalry when Sputnik came out, became actually space collaboration with Russian cosmonauts and US astronauts living in each other's space stations and international space stations and so on. And these were two systems who were wanting, if not physically, at least ideologically, to destroy each other. Well, of course, we know how that India. But during the time the conflict, the logical conflict, the physical was alive, there was also this kind of cooperation. So I think I'll stop there with those questions. I think for the time being,
when I said superpowers never cooperate, I said it's a niche, and it is certainly a post Second World War phenomenon. But theoretically speaking, if there is one dominant power which is superpower, and if there is another power which assumes to, which aspires to assume that power, so we always have a situation of challenge, and that's where from that point of view I said that superpowers never compete. And talking about knowledge is power, I agree. I don't disagree with that. But in intra-relations, you might be a storehouse of knowledge, but ultimately, it comes down to your ability to exercise power, your ability and intention to exercise power. And I think that brings me to, again, Ambassador Srinivasan's point, that in times to come, India and China might emerge as economic powerhouses, but United States will remain the number one army. So that would be a peculiar situation. I think, yes, but the only way I can kind of moderate that peculiarity is that United States, in spite of remaining the number one power for a long period of time, will not has started not behaving like the number one power in the international system. It doesn't matter how much power you have, but if you do not have the intention of using that power, so that power is as good as being absent. So in that situation, probably that peculiarity can be moderated, or else obviously it's a peculiar situation. So that's probably all that I would say. But just one point on what Ravi Bhuthalingam said, that countries do collaborate. I absolutely agree with that. I said countries will collaborate, and India and China will cooperate in many areas, in many areas. But what I said, that it will never define the India-China relationship. There will be cooperation, there will be collaborations like the Chinese and the Japanese are having, the Chinese and the US are having, but it will never define the relationship. The relationship between India and China will always be termed as competitive. Thank you.
I'll take on the three questions very quickly. Firstly, regarding the China-Pakistan economic corridor. If you look at geography, it's not really workable to the extent that you say. But if you want to collaborate with China on that, you have to have a dialogue with China, where I personally think, and I think Ambassador Srinivasan would also agree with me, and I've heard him talk about on the subject, is that we should have attended the meeting that they held on OVO, and we should have contested issues. That look, you're taking it through disputed territory, at least get them to accept that. Similarly, you should have at least got some contested and tried to get into some agreement to them that, okay, if you want us to join, will you settle the border dispute? Those issues should have been negotiated. An attempt should have been made. We failed to do so. As far as coming through Kashmir is concerned, it doesn't really geographically work out. That is reality, in terms of terrain, in terms of the present structure. Coming on to the next question, interagencies, I am afraid you'll have to ask them. I wouldn't know. Thirdly, regarding the issue of surgical strikes, I'd request you not to use the term surgical strike. It's a political term. When I was GOC 15 Corps, way back some time ago, I have launched innumerable strikes across the border. This was politicization of these strikes. Similarly, when I was GOC 2 Dev in Eastern Command looking after the Northeast, I have also launched a number of strikes across the border against NSCNK and the PLA and other elements into Myanmar. But you don't make a noise about these things. The moment you make a noise, you annoy the other country. We have annoyed Myanmar by doing it. That's reality. So please don't use the term surgical strikes. Then, the last point I do have is whether we like it or not. The truth of the matter is, yes, we don't trust each other. Yes, we've got a dispute. But for God's sake, there are only 2 countries in the world with whom the dispute is unsettled. So we've got to make the effort, we've got to engage China to try and resolve that dispute to the extent feasible. And that cannot come by confrontation. It has to be engagement and diplomatic engagement. Similarly, trade. Trade is essential. But at the same time, you have to counterbalance the issue of the trade deficit, flooding us with cheap Chinese goods, and so on. And similarly, the other issues. So whether we like it or not, engagement is mandatory. Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the table here for excellent presentations. Thank you very much, sir.
And I want to add to that, India and China are certainly on a brink of choice, and it'd be interesting to see how they choose to engage or not going forward in the next few years. It's my privilege to, thank an amazing panel, both for session 1 and session 2. We were delighted and greatly appreciative of Professor Shuranjan Das making his inaugural remarks and setting the stage for this symposium. And our moderators and chair, certainly they're the pivot of a session, and they truly do kind of, guide the way the sessions, are shaped. And so Ambassador Srinivasan and General Mukherjee, appreciate you anchoring both the sessions. We had an amazing range of speakers, and I certainly did. It's rarely that I sit and truly listen to, sessions, because I'm always kind of trying to, be in and out. But I was amazed by the range and diversity of thought and subjects and topics which were covered between the 2 sessions. So greatly appreciative for the different perspectives we got in the first session from Professor Shaburi Mitro. Thank you for being here from JNU. Professor Anindya Jyoti Mojumdar. I know he certainly drew a lot of his students in on that, and we appreciated the Chinese consulate's presence, Mr. Zhang's. And for our second session, Mr. Bhuthalingam, thank you for that very engaging, perspective. Professor Vinoda Kumar Mishra and General for anchoring it. And mostly for our die-hard audience, thank you for being through this afternoon and not deserting us, because we really did appreciate you being here. Thank you. And I would be very amiss if I forgot Professor Shivashish Chatterjee and his team. Thank you for hosting us, the School of International Relations and Strategic Studies. Thank you for hosting us, organizing, your team organizing this event, and Mr. Bhuthalingam for ICS for partnering on this event.